June 1944, the Philippine Sea. Night falls across the endless Pacific, broken only by the red glow of instrument panels inside the carrier USS Lexington. The hum of machinery mixes with the low crackle of radio chatter. Deep below deck in a cramped radar control room, a young operator leans toward the glowing green circle before him. A faint cluster of dots flickers into view. 300 miles out, moving fast. He calls it in. Above, flight crews rush to their stations. Engines roar awake. Within minutes, squadrons of F6F Hellcats are clawing into the dark sky, guided not by sight, but by the invisible hand of radar. Far across the ocean, aboard the Japanese carrier Shokaku, officers stare into the black void. Their lookouts see nothing. Their instruments tell them nothing. The enemy seems silent, but in truth the Americans already know exactly where they are, and how to strike. By the time the first bombs fall, it's no longer a battle of men and machines. It's a battle of vision versus blindness. And the Japanese commanders will soon realize that the Pacific is no longer theirs to see. When war erupted across the Pacific in December 1941, Japan's empire stood at the height of its power. From the Philippines to Malaya, their navy ruled vast blue horizons with unmatched confidence. Their carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, were symbols of modern naval might, guided by pilots who had trained for years in precision strikes. The attack on Pearl Harbor proved that skill and surprise could cripple even the most powerful adversary. But beneath that triumph lay a crucial blind spot, one Japan did not yet understand. For all its might, Imperial Japan fought in a world still bound by the limits of human eyes. Its ships and aircraft depended on visual spotting, lookouts, and scouting float planes. At night or in poor weather, the ocean became a vast, silent void. But the Americans, though caught off guard at Pearl Harbor, were already nurturing a secret weapon born not of steel, but of science. Radar, or radio detection and ranging, had begun as an experimental curiosity in the 1930s, a concept shared among several nations. Britain had its chain home stations. Germany explored it for air defense. The United States pursued it quietly, underfunded but persistent. On the eve of Pearl Harbor, the U.S. Army Signal Corps operated a handful of primitive radar units, the SCR-270, with limited range and reliability. On the morning of December 7, 1941, one such unit sat on the northern tip of Oahu. At 7:02 a.m., two young radar operators, George Elliott and Joseph Lockard, saw a massive formation of aircraft approaching the island. They called it in. The report was dismissed, assumed to be American bombers arriving from California. An hour later, Japanese aircraft rained fire on Pearl Harbor. The warning had been real, but it had come too early for a nation still learning what radar truly meant. The attack changed everything. Within weeks, the U.S. military poured funding, engineers, and urgency into radar development. Laboratories at MIT and Bell Labs began working around the clock. The newly established Radiation Laboratory, known simply as the RAD Lab, became the beating heart of America's radar revolution. Scientists like Lee Dubridge, Luis Alvarez, and Robbie were tasked with turning fragile prototypes into battle-ready systems. In Washington, military strategists realized that radar would become the eyes of the modern fleet. The Pacific Ocean, vast, unpredictable, and filled with deadly ambushes, could no longer be navigated by guesswork. Early radar stations were set up across Hawaii, the Aleutians, and Midway. Engineers learned to mount radar antennas on warships, overcoming interference from salt spray and rolling seas. Each new test brought new possibilities: clearer signals, longer range, faster tracking. Meanwhile, Japan saw radar as an interesting but secondary tool. Their research institutions, though capable, lacked the industrial scale and urgency of their American counterparts. Japanese admirals believed their air power and training would remain decisive, not invisible waves on a screen. Their scientists worked on sets like the Type 21 and Type 22 ship radars, but production was slow and limited. Few in the Imperial Navy trusted them in battle. Throughout 1942, as the tides of war began to shift, the consequences of that difference became clear. In the early carrier battles, Coral Sea and Midway, radar-equipped American ships detected incoming raids minutes before they appeared on the horizon. At Midway, radar warnings allowed fighter squadrons to intercept Japanese bombers before they reached their targets. It wasn't yet perfect, but it was a glimpse of the future. By contrast, Japanese fleets still depended on lookouts scanning endless horizons, their binoculars fogged with salt and smoke. At night, they relied on flares, intuition, and courage. But courage could not pierce through darkness. What began as a technological curiosity was fast becoming the silent compass of the Pacific. The Americans could now sense movement beyond visibility, fleets, bombers, submarines, all reflected in faint pulses of radio energy. It was an entirely new dimension of warfare, one Japan had not prepared to fight. By late 1942, the U.S. Navy understood something profound. Whoever could see first would strike first, and radar, an invisible, tireless, and unblinking one, was about to make the Pacific visible. By 1943, the Pacific had transformed into a vast experimental ground for radar warfare. What began as a handful of crude warning sets now stretched into an intricate network of detection lines, island stations, shipborne radars, and airborne scanners, all feeding a single, growing advantage: awareness. The Americans moved swiftly, driven by lessons learned in blood. From Midway to Guadalcanal, commanders understood that every extra minute of warning could save ships, squadrons, and entire fleets. To achieve that, the U.S. Navy and Army Signal Corps turned radar from a lab invention into an operational doctrine. By late 1944, it had produced thousands, compact, rugged, and reliable systems designed for every environment imaginable. From island outposts to submarines, radar became the silent heartbeat of the U.S. military. The SG Surface Search Radar was one of the most important, operating on a 10-centimeter wavelength. It used the newly developed cavity magnetron, a British innovation shared under wartime alliance, to detect ships at 15 to 20 miles, and even periscopes at shorter ranges. Mounted on destroyers, cruisers, and submarines, it gave the Americans a night-fighting edge that Japan could not match. Then came the SCR-584, a radar so advanced it could automatically track targets and guide anti-aircraft guns with uncanny precision. When installed on Pacific Islands, it turned air defense into a coordinated machine. American gunners were no longer shooting at where aircraft were, but where they would be. Each new innovation shortened the gap between detection and action. Radar systems evolved from bulky towers into compact units with rotating dishes, oscillating beacons, and flickering cathode ray tubes. In the glow of these screens, human intuition merged with mathematics. Engineers from the MIT Radiation Laboratory, Bell Labs, and Naval Research Laboratory developed dozens of variants, airborne, seaborne, and land-based. The once theoretical magnetron became the engine of practical dominance. What had taken Britain years to establish during the Blitz, the U.S. replicated and expanded across oceans. Meanwhile, Japan's technology stagnated. Their Type 21 and Type 22 radars, though inspired by captured or observed Allied equipment, operated on meter-band wavelengths, limiting resolution and range. Without microwave radar, Japanese ships remained nearly blind in night combat. This technological chasm, invisible but absolute, defined the next phase of the Pacific War. Behind the cold machinery of radar was a distinctly human struggle, one of patience, fatigue, and quiet vigilance. Radar operators were often young, barely out of high school, trained to interpret patterns that few others understood. Inside steel compartments aboard carriers like the Enterprise or Essex, or within bamboo huts on tiny atolls, they lived in half-light. Hours blurred into each other as they stared at circular screens, watching for the faintest tremor of a moving dot. Sweat dripped in the humid air as the soft hum of equipment filled their world. Theirs was not a heroic battlefield, it was a battle of endurance. Radar operators had to read echoes like fingerprints. They learned to distinguish between false returns, birds, waves, weather, and the telltale pulse of approaching aircraft. In that quiet tension, a single decision could save hundreds of lives. During carrier operations, these men were the hidden eyes of the fleet. Fighter direction officers, FDOs, would stand beside them, issuing rapid commands through headsets. Vector 270, climb to 15,000, intercept bearing 120. Somewhere above the ocean, pilots followed these instructions without ever seeing the enemy until tracer fire filled the sky. At forward bases, radar crews became the first line of defense. On Saipan, radar stations detected Japanese raids hours before they reached the island. On Guadalcanal, their warnings gave anti-aircraft batteries precious minutes to prepare. The reports were often short and coded. Angels 20, bearing 085, range 80 miles. But behind those clipped transmissions were human voices, steady under pressure, fighting fear with focus. The work was monotonous yet terrifying. Every blip could mean death approaching. Operators slept in shifts, ate at their consoles, and spent weeks without daylight. Yet, in those unseen rooms, they rewrote the nature of war. Many radar men never saw the faces of the pilots or sailors they protected. Their victories were silent, uncelebrated. But every intercepted bomber, every avoided ambush was their doing. In interviews years later, some spoke of their strange sense of isolation. "We were there, but not there," one veteran recalled. "We never fired a gun, but we could see the enemy before anyone else did." It was this quiet brotherhood of watchers, unknown to most of the fleet, who turned the U.S. Navy's carriers into floating fortresses, and while they sat behind their screens, somewhere beyond the horizon, their counterparts in the Imperial Japanese Navy were staring into empty skies, still waiting for the enemy to appear. Because by 1944, the Americans no longer fought by sight. They fought by signal, by frequency, by time. The Pacific had become a battlefield of invisible lines, drawn not by ships or shells, but by waves of light that no one could see. By 1944, radar had become more than a tool. It was the nervous system of the U.S. Pacific Fleet. For the first time in naval history, admirals could command vast formations in total darkness, confident that their ships knew exactly where friend and foe were positioned. Before radar, night battles were chaos. Identification was nearly impossible. Ships often fired on their own and engagements relied on luck. But with radar plotting boards and centralized combat information centers, CICs, U.S. fleets now fought as a single organism. Every destroyer's pulse of energy painted the sea around it. Those readings were sent to flagships, where officers traced enemy movements on grease pencil boards. From those glowing rooms, commanders could predict enemy courses, coordinate torpedo spreads, and direct fighter squadrons to intercept before the enemy even knew they'd been spotted. The Battle of the Bismarck Sea in March 1943 showed the first glimpses of this new warfare. American and Australian aircraft, guided by radar and coast watchers, ambushed a Japanese convoy carrying reinforcements to New Guinea. The result was devastating. 8 transports and 4 destroyers sunk, with thousands of troops lost. Radar had made surprise one-sided. Soon, U.S. carriers conducted operations that would have been impossible 2 years earlier. Night takeoffs, coordinated strikes under cloud cover, and radar-controlled interceptions. The Japanese, still dependent on visual sighting and radio reports, were often attacking ghosts. On land, radar directed anti-aircraft fire with machine-like precision. The SCR-584 radar and proximity fuses turned Japanese air raids into suicide missions. Fighters were scrambled on schedule, searchlights guided automatically, and guns fired where mathematics said the planes would be, not where they were seen. It was warfare elevated to prediction, combat fought on the threshold of invisibility. The Imperial Japanese Navy tried to adapt. They trained night fighter units and installed limited radar on some destroyers and cruisers, but the systems were crude and range-limited. They lacked integration. There was no unified tactical picture, no real coordination. The Americans, on the other hand, had fused radar data with radio communication and encryption. The result was total battlefield awareness, the ability to sense, move, and strike faster than human sight could react. Radar had given the Allies what the Japanese once had at Pearl Harbor, the power of surprise. In the war's early years, Japan had been the hunter. Her naval aviators were the best in the world, her ships fast and disciplined, her submarines deadly. But by 1943, that hunter's confidence began to crumble, and radar was one of the silent reasons why. Japanese reconnaissance had little understanding of the full extent of America's radar network. Their intelligence reports mentioned radio detection systems, but the sheer scale, from island chains to mobile units, was beyond what they imagined. Japan's high command assumed these systems were localized, easily jammed, or ineffective over long distances. They were wrong. As the Allies advanced through the Central Pacific, radar not only guided fleets but coordinated entire invasions. At Tarawa, Kwajalein, and Saipan, radar controlled bombardments and landings, synchronized ships, aircraft, and amphibious vehicles to the minute. The Japanese defenders, relying on sound and sight, often didn't realize the invasion had begun until shells were already falling. Japanese scientists, such as those at the Navy Technical Research Institute, understood the science of radar but lacked the materials, especially magnetrons and precision instruments, to mass-produce them. Their Type 13 air search radar, fielded in late 1943, was a step forward but still primitive compared to the American SK systems. It could detect aircraft at roughly 60 miles, but it was bulky, slow, and difficult to maintain. The deeper issue, however, was belief. Many Japanese admirals clung to doctrines rooted in personal valor and visual combat. Battleships and aircraft carriers were seen as extensions of the warrior spirit. Technology, in their minds, could never replace courage. Even when radar data suggested unseen threats, officers often dismissed the readings as errors. A Japanese radar operator might report a faint echo of enemy bombers approaching, only to be told to confirm by visual sighting. By the time confirmation came, the bombs were already falling. This disbelief proved fatal at several critical moments. During the Battle of the Philippine Sea, Japanese commanders underestimated American detection capabilities. They believed their strike groups could approach undetected, as they once had at Pearl Harbor. But the Americans had long since built radar coverage stretching hundreds of miles from their carriers. The result was catastrophic. Wave after wave of Japanese aircraft intercepted and destroyed before ever reaching their targets. Technology alone doesn't win wars, and leadership does. And radar's story is as much about insight as invention. American commanders like Admiral Raymond Spruance and Admiral Chester Nimitz understood what radar meant strategically. They invested in training, integration, and doctrine. They created new naval roles, fighter direction officers, combat information center teams, and made radar the core of modern command. Japan, meanwhile, had brilliant tacticians but few true technologists. Admirals like Isoroku Yamamoto foresaw America's industrial potential. But after his death in 1943, Japan's naval leadership grew increasingly desperate and rigid. Their faith remained in the courage of pilots and the speed of attack, not in invisible science. That contrast, pragmatic innovation versus traditional valor, mirrored the larger war itself. By 1944, Japan's once mighty fleet was navigating blind, unaware that every signal, every movement, every aircraft formation was being tracked by unseen eyes, and as the stage set for the Battle of the Philippine Sea, that blindness would finally meet its reckoning. June 19, 1944, the Philippine Sea. Dawn breaks over a steel-gray horizon. On the decks of 15 American carriers, hundreds of aircraft stand ready, wings folded, engines ticking, crews silent in ritual preparation. The sea is calm, but tension vibrates through every rivet of the fleet. Admiral Raymond Spruance's Fifth Fleet, anchored around Task Force 58, waits like a coiled spring. Across the expanse, unseen beyond the curve of the earth, the Imperial Japanese Navy is also preparing, convinced that today they will deliver the decisive blow to reclaim the Pacific. But what they cannot see will destroy them. At 4 a.m., operators aboard the USS Lexington and USS Essex begin scanning their radar screens. The air search sets, massive SK and SM units, hum with power. Within moments, faint signals appear. Dozens of small dots gather in formation nearly 350 miles west. The blips grow stronger, marching slowly toward the fleet. The word moves fast through the command decks. Large enemy air formation, bearing 270. Spruance and Vice Admiral Mark Mitcher exchange quiet nods. Orders go out instantly. Fighter squadrons are scrambled. In the CIC, the Combat Information Center, Young radar men trace enemy vectors with grease pencils. Fighter directors calculate interception points on transparent boards lit from beneath. Radio operators feed instructions to pilots climbing into the brightening sky. It is a symphony of coordination, mathematics, communication, and courage fused together by invisible energy. Minutes later, the first American Hellcats make contact, guided purely by radar vectors. From the cockpit of an F6F, the pilots see the enemy glinting in the morning sun. More than 300 Japanese aircraft, dive bombers, torpedo bombers, and escorts. They are approaching in rigid formations, still unaware they've been detected. Bogies confirmed, a pilot reports. We have them in sight. The battle begins. Radar continues to feed real-time information to every ship. As one wave of Japanese planes falls, another is already being tracked. Fighter directors coordinate intercepts so precise that incoming formations are met dozens of miles before reaching the fleet. On carriers below, crews hear distant explosions, the echoes of a fight already decided before it began. Japanese radar, by contrast, sees nothing beyond a few dozen miles. Their command ships receive fragmented reports. One scout claims to have seen enemy carriers, another cannot confirm. The system is chaotic, reliant on eyesight and radio. As their aircraft close in, American interceptors descend upon them from above like hawks. By noon, more than 200 Japanese aircraft are burning in the sky or sinking beneath the waves. The Americans call it a turkey shoot, but the real story lies beneath the gunfire, in the quiet efficiency of radar screens glowing below decks. On the USS Bunker Hill, a radar officer calmly watches new blips forming at extreme range, another wave inbound. He marks their position, calculates their course, and transmits the data. Fighter squadrons turn to intercept with perfect timing. Every pilot's success begins as a flicker of light on his screen. The Japanese pilots flying through thick clouds cannot even locate their targets. They drop bombs into empty ocean. Radio confusion reigns. Some think they are over the American fleet when they are hundreds of miles away. By late afternoon, 4 major attack waves have been annihilated. American losses are minimal. The Japanese fleet, once confident in the art of surprise, has been stripped of its most vital weapon, initiative. Admiral Ozawa, commanding the Japanese mobile fleet, receives reports so contradictory he cannot tell truth from error. His scouts fail to find the enemy. His strike groups vanish without return. What radar had given the Americans clarity, Japan now lacked completely. For hours, Ozawa's staff argue whether the enemy carriers are east or south. No one knows. The sea has turned featureless, the radio static endless. Meanwhile, on American decks, burned and battered Hellcats return. Deck crews rush to refuel and rearm them for another intercept. Inside the CICs, the atmosphere remains disciplined. Each radar sweep, each echo is a new threat anticipated before it arrives. By sunset, 350 Japanese aircraft lie destroyed, more than half their carrier air strength. The Americans have lost fewer than 30. The sky belongs entirely to radar, and yet, this is only the first half of the storm. Because while Japanese commanders reel from the devastation in the air, their fleets are still trying to maneuver under the illusion of secrecy. They believe nightfall will bring them cover. But radar has taken the night too. Night of June 19, 1944, the Philippine Sea. Darkness falls over the vast Pacific. In the old days of naval warfare, this was the time when the ocean went blind, when fleets vanished into shadow, and only the moon and intuition guided men through the void. But in 1944, the U.S. Navy no longer fears the dark. Below deck, inside the dimly lit combat information centers, radar screens glow like constellations. The operators, most barely out of their teens, sit in headphones, calling out contacts, bearings, and distances in clipped, steady voices. Each flicker of light on those screens represents a ship, a plane, or sometimes a ghost echo. But to the trained eye, even ghosts tell stories. The radar's sweeping beam stretches across the Black Sea, piercing cloud and distance, revealing movements invisible to the human eye. It is as if the Americans have stolen sight from the night itself. Admiral Spruance, cautious but calculating, orders his task forces to maintain formation. "We will not rush blindly," he tells his staff. "Let them come to us." His patience, guided by radar intelligence, will soon prove fatal for the Japanese fleet. Far to the west, aboard the Japanese flagship Taiho, chaos brews under a different kind of darkness. Their radar, primitive and short-ranged, flickers intermittently, blind spots everywhere. Reports arrive late, incomplete, and sometimes outright wrong. Admiral Ozawa, still believing his morning airstrikes had crippled the Americans, prepares to launch more. But his scout planes have failed to find anything. His carriers drift like shadows, exposed yet unaware. Then, disaster. A single American submarine, USS Albacore, lurking beneath the waves, picks up the Japanese fleet's position. Guided by sonar and radar readings from surface units relayed through coded communication, the Albacore lines up her shot. At 8:10 a.m., a torpedo slams into the Taiho. The explosion tears open her aviation fuel tanks. At first, the damage seems contained. Damage control crews rush to patch the holes. But the ship's ventilation system spreads gasoline vapors throughout the hull. Hours later, a spark, perhaps from an electric motor, ignites the fumes. At 15:30, the Taiho, pride of the Imperial Navy and its newest carrier, erupts in a thunderous fireball. She breaks apart and sinks, taking more than 1,600 men with her. Japanese radio silence breaks with frantic, confused transmissions. No one can confirm what hit them. To Ozawa's staff, it seems unthinkable. How could the enemy have found them in open sea? But the Americans know exactly where they are. By evening, radar picks up dozens of faint returns to the west, the remnants of Ozawa's force, trying to flee. Admiral Mitcher seizes the opportunity. He orders a massive strike at maximum range. More than 200 aircraft from Essex, Yorktown, Lexington, and Bunker Hill roar off into the sunset, following bearings calculated entirely by radar data. It is a desperate gamble. The pilots know they will have to return in darkness, low on fuel, with no moon to guide them. But the chance to finish Japan's carrier fleet is too great to ignore. Hours later, over 300 miles away, the strike groups find their targets: Japanese carriers Hiyo, Suikaku, and Chiyoda, along with battleships and cruisers. The sea below is lit by anti-aircraft fire and burning oil. The Hiyo takes 2 torpedo hits and explodes, vanishing into a column of flame. Another carrier, Zuikaku, survivor of Pearl Harbor, is set ablaze, limping into the darkness. For the Japanese, it is the beginning of the end. But for the Americans, the night is far from over. As the strike groups turn home, darkness consumes the sky. Many pilots lose orientation. Fuel gauges drop toward empty. Carrier crews listen helplessly to distress calls over the radio, faint voices fading into static. Then, in one of the most daring decisions of the war, Admiral Mitcher gives the order: turn on the lights. Every carrier in Task Force 58, each one a floating beacon that could attract enemy submarines, switches on its deck lights, signal beacons, and searchlights. The horizon, once pitch black, glows with a ribbon of light. Radar operators aboard the carriers begin guiding pilots home, vector by vector. Even in near-zero visibility, they can track returning aircraft miles out. Controllers use radar bearings to align their approach paths, calling out final headings. Blue leader, you're 1 mile out. Steady at 90 degrees. Descend to 300 feet. You're on the beam. Come in now. One by one, exhausted pilots land in near darkness. Many crash, some ditch in the sea, but hundreds make it home, saved not by luck but by the unseen precision of radar guidance. By dawn, the American fleet counts the cost and the victory. 3 Japanese carriers destroyed, more than 400 aircraft downed, and the loss of nearly every experienced Japanese naval aviator. The Great Marianas Turkey Shoot, as it would be called, is not just an air battle. It is the moment radar became the most decisive weapon of the war. From that day forward, Japan would never again regain control of the skies, and the men who once laughed at the glowing screens on American ships now understood. The light they mocked was the light that doomed them. By dawn on June 20th, 1944, the vast Pacific was eerily calm again. Smoke drifted over the horizon where the Japanese carriers had burned through the night. The sea that had once echoed with the hum of engines and the crash of bombs now carried only debris, floating wreckage, oil slicks, and lifeboats filled with stunned survivors. On the bridges of American carriers, officers stood silently, listening to casualty reports and flight returns. The radar operators, Those quiet figures who had spent the battle in windowless rooms emerged into the sunlight for the first time in nearly 2 days. They were exhausted, pale and trembling from hours of tension, but they had done what generations of sailors before them could not. They had fought and won a battle they could not see. For Japan, the outcome was catastrophic. Admiral Ozawa's mobile fleet, once the pride of the Imperial Navy, was effectively annihilated. 3 carriers, Taiho, Shokaku, and Hio, lay at the bottom of the Philippine Sea. Over 400 aircraft were lost, along with nearly every seasoned pilot who had survived Coral Sea Midway and the Solomons. The Imperial Navy would never recover. What made this defeat so final was not just the loss of ships or planes, but the collapse of Japan's naval intelligence network. Without radar parity, Japan had entered a war of shadows it could no longer navigate. In the post-battle analysis, U.S. Navy intelligence noted that many of the Japanese aircraft were launched in the wrong direction, attacking empty ocean instead of enemy ships. Entire squadrons were lost before they ever found a target. The Americans, meanwhile, used radar intercept vectors to anticipate these attacks hours in advance, repositioning fighter groups with surgical precision. The difference was no longer just tactical, it was philosophical. The Americans had embraced the idea that information, not armor, not firepower, was the key to survival. Radar was not merely a tool, it was an extension of awareness, a way to see beyond the limits of human perception. The Japanese, bound by their pre-war doctrine of visual range and pilot intuition, had failed to adapt. Even as captured reports and aerial reconnaissance showed the Americans using advanced radar systems, Japanese engineers struggled to replicate them. Their sets remained bulky, inaccurate, and easily jammed. One after-action report from the Japanese Navy put it starkly: "Our fleet fought the shadows of a foe who already knew our every move." The sea was no longer ours. In Washington and Pearl Harbor, the victory electrified military planners. The Battle of the Philippine Sea confirmed that radar was not just a defensive measure. It was an offensive weapon of domination. Radar picket ships, airborne early warning planes, and advanced fire control systems became the next frontier. By late 1944, American task forces deployed radar coverage so dense that nothing could move within 300 miles without being tracked. The Imperial Japanese Navy, once feared for its skill and discipline, found itself fighting against an invisible wall. The Americans no longer needed to guess where Japan would strike. They already knew. For the young radar operators who had guided the battle from the shadows, it was a moment of vindication. Many had joined the Navy as technicians, not warriors, mocked by pilots and officers who saw them as screen watchers. But after the Philippine Sea, those glowing screens had proven more decisive than any gun turret. They had turned the tide of war, and Japan's defeat was no longer a matter of if, but when. The U.S. Navy's confidence soared. Within weeks, planning accelerated for the invasion of the Mariana Islands, Guam, Tinian, and Saipan, all now within radar-guided air range of Japan's inner defenses. The Pacific no longer belonged to the rising sun. It belonged to the eyes that could see through the storm. And in every darkened control room from Hawaii to the South Pacific, a steady rhythmic pulse continued to sweep across circular screens, the heartbeat of a new kind of warfare. In Tokyo, the first reports of the disaster reached Imperial headquarters 3 days later. The tone was cautious, almost subdued. Official communique downplayed the losses, claiming that only a few ships had been damaged and that the enemy had suffered heavily. But behind closed doors, the truth was devastating. Admiral Toyota Suemu, Commander-in-Chief of the Combined Fleet, read the intercepted messages in silence. His naval staff realized that the once mighty carrier arm of Japan, built over decades, perfected through sacrifice, was gone. The pilots, the instructors, the maintenance crews, and all gone in a single operation. It was not merely defeat. It was blindness. Japanese intelligence officers tried to explain the failure. Their scouting planes had flown wide but found nothing. Their radar systems failed to detect even large formations. Many believed the Americans were using new mystery devices, capable of seeing through weather and darkness. Few understood that the key had been radar coordination, not magic, a network of shared data linking every ship and plane in real time. The Americans had turned the Pacific into a single, integrated sensor field. When U.S. forces landed on Saipan weeks later, radar once again guided every stage of the invasion. Shore bombardments were adjusted using radar tracking of shell impacts. Landing craft were coordinated through radar beacons placed along the beaches. Even the night air cover, something once considered impossible, operated flawlessly under radar control. For Japan's defenders, it was a nightmare. They fought with courage but not awareness. U.S. aircraft struck from cloud cover, invisible until the moment of attack. Artillery fire found hidden bunkers with mathematical precision. Every attempt at surprise ended in failure. The realization spread among Japanese officers that the Americans were no longer fighting the same kind of war. Where Japan had relied on human senses, America had extended its reach into the invisible. A captured Japanese diary from a radar operator on Guam contained a haunting line. "They see us before we even rise from the sea. We fight ghosts who already know we are coming." In the months that followed, the radar revolution expanded beyond the Navy. B-29 superfortresses flying from newly captured islands used long-range radar navigation to bomb targets in the Japanese homeland, even through cloud and darkness. Tokyo's defenses, designed for visual interception, were helpless. Anti-aircraft batteries fired blindly into the night, guided by guesswork and luck. By early 1945, radar had also transformed submarine warfare. U.S. subs prowled the shipping lanes of the South China Sea, locating convoys through radar sweeps of the surface. Entire supply chains collapsed under the pressure. Japan's once far-reaching empire began to suffocate, not from superior numbers alone, but from technological sight. The balance of power had shifted irreversibly. When the war finally ended in August 1945, Japanese naval officers were among the first to study captured American radar sets. What they saw confirmed their fears. The equipment was smaller, sharper, more reliable, and part of a coordinated web of detection that no individual device could match. Radar had not simply been a new invention. It had been a new way of thinking, a fusion of science, communication, and command discipline that changed how wars were fought forever. Historians would later call the Battle of the Philippine Sea the death of Japan's naval air power. But in truth, it was also the birth of modern electronic warfare. The principles pioneered there, early warning, signal analysis, coordinated radar tracking, would define Cold War defense systems, missile detection networks, and even space surveillance. For the men who had once sat before flickering screens aboard ships like Lexington and Enterprise, it was vindication beyond measure. Their quiet vigilance had ended an empire's dominance and reshaped the nature of warfare. And for Japan, it marked a tragic lesson that courage without vision can no longer win wars in the age of machines. The Pacific fell silent again, but this time the silence belonged to those who could still see through it. In the calm that followed the storm, the Pacific returned to its timeless rhythm, waves folding over wreckage, salt air drifting across empty skies. But beneath that silence lay a transformation deeper than any battle could show. For centuries, war had been fought by what men could see. The soldier's eye, the sailor's horizon, the pilot's instinct. These were the limits of perception. But in 1944, on the dark waters of the Philippine Sea, those limits were shattered. Radar had given humanity a new kind of sight, one that could pierce fog, darkness, and distance. It turned the invisible into the knowable. The American fleet, guided not by luck or superstition but by precision and mathematics, had changed the essence of warfare itself. Japan's admirals, trained in the art of intuition and bravery, faced something they could not feel or predict. They were fighting an enemy that no longer relied on vision alone, an enemy that could see without seeing. And in that realization came the quiet end of an era, the age of romantic warfare, of ships meeting by chance and fleets vanishing into mist, was gone. In its place stood a world governed by signals, data, and the unseen pulse of machines. The radar blip on a green screen had replaced the lookout's cry. The hum of electronics had replaced the roar of the scout plane. Knowledge had become the ultimate weapon, and blindness, the ultimate defeat. From that moment on, every future war, from Korea to the Persian Gulf, from space to cyberspace, would trace its lineage to those faint circles of light spinning in the darkness of 1944. The Japanese commanders had realized it too late. The Pacific no longer belonged to those who sailed it. It belonged to those who could see across it. And as the radar beam swept its endless circle, illuminating the unseen world one pulse at a time, it marked the beginning of a new truth in human history. In war, sight is survival, and the future belongs to those who can see first.